Hello, thanks for coming. So before I start, I really sincerely put up my Twitter handle and my email address because I've discovered that after I talk, particularly in Europe, nobody comes and asks me questions afterwards. So if you're more introverted and you prefer to use text, please do that and do that. Because the whole reason I come here is to have conversations. So I want to make sure I engage with you folks afterwards. So for those of you that don't know me very well or don't know much about me, this is apparently all you need to know. I'm a bottle of rum. But I started off on this journey doing a couple of different things, and I've kind of come into it from a couple of different angles. But the one that started an interesting discussion was this tweet from Scott Gell. I don't know if you know Scott Gell very well. He's a web performance guy, and he had this tweet a few months ago about making sure that your web page is performant, that you are fast enough. And I'm mostly a UX kind of guy. I mostly work on the design side of things. And I was like, well, this shouldn't be a big deal. I just have a tiny little web page. I have a little blog, and I try to be a good responsive citizen. I have a responsive theme, and because I'm a UX designer, I roll up my sleeves and I have a child theme so I can jettison all sorts of stuff and make sure it's really minimal. I'm like, this is a piece of cake, so I just went it. And of course, his goal was to be less than 3,000. And of course, I came in at 5,137. I'm like, what the hell? He's like, what's going on? So I rolled up my sleeves, I put up Chrome DevTools, and I'm like going through what's going on. And it turns out that WordPress kind of sucks. I didn't know that. I mean, it's kind of good for an awful lot of stuff, but it was 301 redirecting for all my thumbnails. I'm like, what's going on? So I went ahead and I changed the thumbnails. I poked around a little bit and did a few more things. Turned out that my website, my server, my IP, my web host wasn't doing quite well, so I switched over. By the way, totally unpaid thing. I switched over to SiteGround. The people that are here in the lobby. Awesome people, and I had significantly faster response time, and I got it down to, boom, 2354. Yes! A UX designer can do techie stuff. And so I was able to actually get it quite fast, and I felt really good about that. But it started a rather interesting conversation about what is this idea of speed? Why do we care about speed so much? Because what does it really mean? And people often forget that back in the 90s, when I started as a designer, we weren't called UX designers. We were called UI designers, user interface designers, because we focused just on the page. And I think in terms of speed, we have the same issue. We're working on just the page, but we don't talk about the broader experience. How do we move from I to X? Because what does it mean for people to experience your site? How do they get to your site? Because then people kind of go, well, it's simple, they just click on a link. Well, fine, but how do they get to that page? Well, they clicked on another link. And pretty soon it's like turtles all the way down. You know, it's just like you just go from one page to the next. So I'm like, that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that, but are we really going to live in this virtual world where we never escape, where it's always virtual? Because my question is like, well, you know, where are you using it? In what context do you want to get to a particular site? And people will say, oh, of course, you're just on desktop, or you're on mobile. I'm like, well, yeah, that's fine too, but that wasn't my question. My question was, where are you? You answered, how? And I'm like, okay, fine. But then when you realize that this idea of using the web in the real world is actually a very old question. People have been trying this for an awful long time. Because let's say you want to use it inside of a store, or in a mall, or at a bus stop. There's lots of ways in which people have wanted to be able to bring the web into the physical world. But how have we tried it so far? Well, we've tried things like this. And we all know how well they work, right? I mean, has anybody seen this Tumblr? Pictures of people scanning QR codes? This is the part I love the most. No posts yet. It's just like, and now to be fair, because you know we need to be, it does work in two countries, Japan and China, for very complicated reasons I won't get into. But even when they do work, they tend to work mostly in print forms, in billboards and receipts. It's a very narrow use case of when they're being used. But what's happening, though, is we are seeing other people playing around with physical interaction, bringing things interactive. But what we're seeing is not the web. We're seeing it actually with native applications. They're kind of ignoring the web entirely, and that's fine. I'm not criticizing them. That's the only choice they have. But whether it's a smart TV or a smart vending machine or a smart bus stop, what we're seeing is everyone has their own application. And it allows them to kind of talk to these things and interact with them. So people are discovering the value. It's useful to do this, but the web is just being completely left behind. It's just not even an option right now. But if we believe in Moore's law at all, we may have a couple of these things in our life today, and then maybe in 6 months we might have 7 or 8, and then maybe in a year we might have 30. But it's like, where is this going? Where is it stopping? Are we really going to be caching all of these apps on my phone in the chance I might stumble across something I want to interact with? It just doesn't make any sense. The superpower of the web, the thing that it can do better than anything else on the planet, is interaction on demand. You just click and you go. It's just a click, a tap, a select, and you can kind of interact with almost anything quickly and lightly. And I don't believe people really appreciate that, because that's kind of exactly what we need to talk to these physical devices if we want to, as we walk up to them. As the web has been talking over the last 25 years, talking and growing, we've been getting really excited about this white rectangle, the DOM. And it's where all the really amazing things happen. It's like all the magic goes here, and all the spec sheets and all the workshops focus on that little white rectangle. But what about this place? This place is really, really boring. It's like if you want to go anywhere, it's kind of like www.twitterI. It's like we have now made the most amazing rendering engine on the planet, and we've strapped a DOS prompt on top of it. I mean, it's like, wait a second, why are we doing that? Why can't the URL bar evolve as well, as long as everything else? So in a sense, this rather obvious insight is that the web needs a discovery service. The web doesn't need to be reinvented. It just needs to have this little on-ramp that lets us get to it a little bit more easily. So imagine, for example, that you were outside and there was a vending machine and a bus stop and a parking meter or something like that, and they were maybe, say, broadcasting their URL wirelessly. And then you needed to basically walk up in that environment and to discover them. How would you figure that out? How would you present that to the user? Because the intention is that once you have these things broadcasting, what you can then do is just have a small little piece of software on your phone that finds all of those things and then ranks them and gets a little bit of information for them. Because if you were to just show the URLs, that would be a little obscure. So in a sense, what you want to do is to say, here's a vending machine with its kind of weird, strange thing it wants you to do, and then there's a bus service and a pay-at parking. So we have effectively a title and a little bit of a snippet and a URL that looks a little bit like a search result, right? But the idea is to show you these things that are around you, and then when you click on it, it just basically takes you to the web. So we're not really changing or upending the whole world with a whole new mechanism. We're just allowing people to kind of find the things around them. So how would this work? I'm going to go a little technical. The thing that we're doing right now is we're using Bluetooth beacons. Here is a Bluetooth beacon right here. It's kind of about the size of a Monty Python Thin Mint. That probably isn't a good analogy, but and it has a tiny little battery in it, and this thing will run for 7 months, which probably isn't enough for industrial uses, but they have versions that are slightly bigger that run for 3 years, which in technology terms is practically infinity. And these things just broadcast a URL over and over, just out in the wild. Now this is using Bluetooth low energy, not to be confused with regular Bluetooth Classic. I hate Bluetooth Classic with the heat of 1,000 suns. I will never, ever program Bluetooth Classic ever again. My first version of Physical Web was built on Bluetooth Classic, and I pretty much almost gave up on the spot. But the huge advantage of Bluetooth Low Energy is it's a little bit like, if you are familiar with networking terms, UDP. It just broadcasts out. There can be 1,000 people in the room, and they can all receive it. And this has no idea. It's just simply a one-way ticket. And so often people are saying things like, oh, you're going to be tracked. Well, yes, there are things that track you, but we can design technology to not track you. Just because something is technically possible doesn't mean it's inevitable. So we're designing this thing to be privacy-friendly, not trackable, and so forth. So this just broadcasts out. It has no idea that you're around. And then if your phone comes by, it kind of goes, oh, hey, I found something, and then it can show it to you. And it basically just finds the URL. But then, as I mentioned before, it doesn't just show you the URL. It actually goes to a proxy server and then gets that extra information. And this is really critical because it protects the user. You do not want the phone to be contacting that website directly. It could be a privacy leakage. In this case, the proxy server gets it for you, protects the user, and then gets all that information for them. So let me I've been talking a little bit on the high level. Let's just do this again. Let me show you how this would work. So in a sense, hello, there we go. So here we are with an iPhone running physical web. You're scanning around, and then boom, there is pay at parking. And now the physical web is done. Now we're just on a web page. And that web page is now going to connect through the cloud to that parking meter. And it goes up, up, and pay. And then it just pays. And then it goes dink, and it pays in the cloud, and it's done. When I show this to people in San Francisco, they kind of break out in tears. Because there's a San Francisco pay it system and nobody can use it. The app sucks and nobody downloads it, and then you get the credit card and it just is terrible. And so this is why the physical web is such a UX-driven thing. The whole idea is to use these things within a couple of taps. But I'm going to kind of violate this basic rule of speaking, which is to kind of going into extra detail and explaining yourself. Because what I have found in explaining this to various crowds is that there's 2 or 3 questions that are like bouncing around inside your head, and it's preventing you from listening to anything else I'm about to say. So I'm going to just take the 3 biggest questions I always get and answer them right now. Just take care of the whole thing. First of all isn't this just a QR code? Come on. I'm like, well, do you remember those previous slides about QR codes? Okay, people don't really use M2R, but technically, yes. This is like a QR code. It's a good way of explaining it functionally. But I like to think of it as a really awesome QR code. There's a difference. Okay, QR codes suck. This does not suck. The difference is that in addition to the QR codes, QR codes aren't very, shall we say, protective of your privacy. If you're going up to a Victoria's Secret poster to get a QR code, it's just kind of like, okay, that's kind of what you're going for. With the whole idea about URLs and being broadcast, it's like you can see 50 things around you. You can see a wide range of things at the same time. Not only that, instead of being right close to you, it can be quite far away. You can see things from like 1 meter to 50 meters away. It's a significantly more flexible and useful way to do that. The other issue I have, though, is that QR codes violate every sense of decency and principle and design possible. Are you really going to be putting a QR code on a toaster? I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen. And on top of that, imagine you've already seen smart light bulbs. A lot of you probably already have smart light bulbs. Does this make any sense? I don't think so. So the whole idea is that you can kind of connect things in a much more lightweight way from a distance. The other one is spam, and I think that's a pretty reasonable concern, that you might get an awful lot of objects. But it's important that we revisit our history. When QR codes first came out, I'm not sure if any of you remember this, but there were these doom and gloom articles that came out. There's like, oh my God, these things are the most insecure things in the world. People are going to be printing them out and putting them over things over the top, and it's just going to be a disaster, and it never happened. Because people keep forgetting that spammers tend to like to work in the bit world, because bits are cheap. It costs a lot of money to go to every single poster in a subway station. I'm not saying it's impossible, but effectively, most spammers are inherently driven by very, very lazy concerns, and it just didn't happen. Now, that doesn't mean we should stop, but I think we should just recall that when QR codes came out, people thought the world was going to end, and it didn't. The other issue is that we do have this proxy service. And the proxy service is helpful because it can take all the URLs, send them up to the proxy service, and then get rid of malicious and spam-based sites so that you can kind of return back a filtered list. This helps quite a bit. The other one is, but wait a second, you're going to have so many things, it's going to be so confusing. I'm like, well, we have a couple of levers that we can pull here. One is simply the fact that we can, if we have a beacon right here in front of you, we can basically rank them based on distance. So the thing that you're closest to can be the top of the list. We can also start doing things like using frequency of use, personal usage, and we can even start adding categories. So there's a lot of levers that we can pull to make this a much more manageable, interesting experience. And besides, for the next year, we're going to be thrilled to see one. So I think we have a little bit of time before we're here to solve this. So this is, in effect, what the physical web is. It's this bridge between the physical and the digital world. Basically, any object can broadcast something, and then a phone can find it. But what I find interesting is it's really a simple idea, and people tend to get it, but they just, it's like, it's the web. And they're not quite sure how it would work because it's just a web page. But instead of being a web page that millions of people see, you could have a web page for millions of devices. It kind of flips the whole thing on its head. And the other value is that it's really just walk up and use. The whole idea is that any device that you can walk to can give you a little bit more information. But the other one is this idea about no interruptions. Because the first beacon product out there was IBeacon, which is a fine product, it established the vocabulary. So everyone assumes that the physical web is going to beep in your pocket. We don't do that. You have to basically pull down the notification manager and ask to see the things that are around you, and then you show them to you. So we really honor the user's decision. The user goes first. Because imagine if we didn't do that. You'd walk into a mall, there'd be 50 beacons, and your phone would vibrate so much it'd probably dance right out of your pocket, right? So we could not do that. We have to respect the user and let them ask, which, by the way, really irritates certain retail companies who really want to send you coupons. I don't really worry about that use case. So let me just reiterate a little bit, because when people see that parking meter demo, they're like, so how are you talking, and what's the protocols, and where's the technology flowing? I go, guys, it's really simple, okay? The parking meter sends a URL to your phone. You see it, you click on it. That's the physical web. The minute you click on it, the physical web is done, and everything else is the web. And that particular demo, in the case of the parking meter, was going through the cloud and using web sockets to talk to the parking meter directly. That's just how we happen to implement it. And then when I explain it to people like that, they kind of go, but that's too hard. How is every single device going to be on the internet like that? That's going to be expensive. You can't do that. And I'm like, have you heard of this thing called the Internet of Things? You know, this whole idea that we're all going to be connected to the internet? It's the kind of thing that everyone's freaking out about. This is that. Okay? And it's like, how can people get so excited about the Internet of Things and then think this is impossible? I don't really quite get that one. And besides, all you have to do is a little bit of a search, and I'm actually one slide ahead. What we're basing this on right now is effectively the beacon standard that we're using is effectively called Eddystone. And it's an open source beacon service that broadcasts two types of frames: a basic ID, which is kind of like IBeacon, and a URL. And that's what the physical web uses. We are just using URLs being broadcast by a Bluetooth beacon over and over and over again. So what we're trying to do is, in effect, create two clouds of things. We want to have a completely standard cloud of things that are just broadcasting URLs in a totally standard way. And then after that, we want to have a whole series of clients that are listening to those URLs and presenting them. And they can be proprietary, we don't care. As long as everyone's broadcasting the same way, everything else will work out fine. But still, when I talk about this, people kind of come up to me and go, Scott, it's the web, with kind of the implied feeling, which really sucks. And I'm like, what? God, what? The web is kind of cool. I've been a little frustrated over the last year. The web's been getting beaten up so much. Because, and as other people have said, there's this native versus web debate that I am just fed up to hear about. It's like it's this horse race, and one will rule them all. And of course, it's Google versus Apple, and one's going to just win. And I'm like, this is the biggest bunch of bullshit ever. It's kind of like saying, imagine a reporter were to come up to you and said, what's going to win, podcasts or e-readers? And you're like, they're both nice? It's a completely arbitrary, ridiculous question. Native and web will both exist. In fact, really sophisticated companies, especially like, say, retailers, have a website and they have an app, because it's really easy to get people on the website, and if you get a really active customer, you then upgrade them to the native app. So this idea of native versus web is ridiculous. What we should be talking, though, about is what's web really good at, and what is its corner? What can it do that native can't do? And that's what I meant before about the interaction on demand. That's what's really valuable. That's what the web can do that the native can't do, and it's our little corner that we should be taking advantage of. And it's why I think the web is so interesting, because the web has so many layers of things that we all know and love, like a URL and web pages and so forth, that we are just going to assume is stuff that is beneath us. So I will talk about 3 classic ways in which you can use the physical web, and it's just kind of up to you. The first is what we call classic web, in which case you've got a bus stop and it's broadcasting a URL to you, and then you just basically go to the cloud and you get a static web page. It's just a real simple kind of QR code-y kind of thing to do. But even here the web is kind of awesome, because when we started implementing this, people were contacting us about how they could modify this. And we're like, it's just a static web page, how does this work? They go, no, you don't get it. When you guys show your result for the bus stop, you have this little description in here. And all we do is we just pull out the description tag on the page and we just serve it up through our proxy service. And they're like, yes, but we want to just change the cache headers so that it's basically every 60 seconds, we'll just update it, so we'll tell you what time the bus comes. So when you pull down the notification manager, you don't even have to go to the web page. And we were like, that's genius. That's just awesome. And we didn't change our code at all. We just made sure that the proxy server honored the cache header, and now there's this whole new use case. This is one of the reasons why the web is just so awesome, because it can do these things and we just let it happen because the web is flexible that way. The other one is this idea, the second way of using it is what happened with the parking meter, this cloud pass-through. So effectively the URL goes to me, I go to the cloud and I fetch the web page, but then that web page on its own decides to talk to the parking meter through WebSockets. I don't care. Physical web doesn't care. That's just the web just being awesome and doing its own thing. And so again, 2 very different use cases that is completely outside of our concern. And when people do get excited about the fact that this cloud pass-through is hard to do, I was getting a little worked up about that a few minutes ago, they don't realize that there's all sorts of devices out there right now that make it really, really easy for you to kind of connect to the web. This one in particular is by a company called Particle. Has anybody heard of Particle? I'm just curious. They used to be called Spark. Yeah. It's basically a little Arduino-ish board with a couple of GPIO pins and a GSM modem that's built into it that can receive, I believe, 10,000 messages a month for a couple of bucks. And in quantity 1, it costs 39 bucks. This allows you to add internet connectivity to almost anything for a very reasonable price. And that's obviously going to go down in price very rapidly. So what we're going to be seeing effectively is devices are going to escape the kind of prison of our home Wi-Fi subnet. That's kind of what you do at home networks, but in public spaces, I'm going to have a device that has its own connectivity. And then my phone will have its own connectivity. We will know nothing about each other's networks, but we need to find each other, and that's what the physical web is doing. It's like, how do I contact you? Just give me a URL and I'll go there. This provides a really good way for the world of smart devices to talk to each other independent of the network. But as I said before, one of the reasons why the web is so awesome is that it's continuing to evolve. I think people don't really appreciate how many really awesome things are coming in the web right now. And they, again, will just make the physical web look good. We'll be exactly the same. So let me give you an example of this. This is using Service Worker. It's a restaurant buzzer. So I walk up to this Bob's Deli. I see it right there. Here's the physical web. I click on it. I'm on the web page. But this now supports Service Worker. And it says, hey, there's 8 people in front of you. Take a number. That installs the Service Worker, effectively then does it. So now I put my phone to sleep. It will get a push notification in a few minutes when it's your turn, and it goes beep, beep, shows up. And now, all of those restaurants that have those big pieces of plastic with LEDs that cost about $2,000 to install can be replaced with a $4 beacon. And that's just Service Worker, just kind of doing it. Now, in this case, it's buzzing in your pocket, but in that, you opted in. There's a big difference. You asked for the service to do it to you. And that's, again, the physical web hasn't changed at all. That's just the Service Worker system being awesome. Now here's a Happy Meal toy. This is another technology. And what we're doing here is we're using a new technology that's been out for a few weeks now called JavaScript Bluetooth. And it's a library that Google is working on with Mozilla to allow your web page to connect to the Bluetooth device in front of you. So in this particular case, we have a little toy we made. We 3D printed it. And now we're going to go see the little Tuga the turtle. And we're on a web page with JavaScript. And I now can then send commands to that turtle directly. I'm not going through the cloud anymore. In this case, I'm choosing happy versus silly or grumpy. I'm giving the personality to the turtle. And then I can choose individual colors. And each one of these taps is going straight to the device. The huge advantage here is that you can now build an interactive device for a couple of dollars. It's very, very inexpensive. And this just has a small little board in it with a JavaScript, a little Bluetooth thing that can receive events. So that's pretty exciting. That's now about a year away, so I'm kind of being a little bit far in the future. But again, it shows you how we don't have to be clever, the physical web team. The web is doing that for us. Next. So, I'm sorry, and this is the third and final category. This is called this direct connection model. So I can have a device that sends a URL to me, I go to the cloud, and then I just basically talk right back to it using JavaScript. And again, it's a model that just takes care of itself. So when we talk about the history of technology, it's a rather interesting point that people often forget. The delta between Netscape and Gmail was 10 years. It takes a while for technology to mature. And so right now, I would claim that the physical web is really in the kind of the Netscape era. We are just trying to get the darn thing going. We just want to get clients out there so that URLs can be found and we can go to web pages. But so much more is going to happen. It'll be a lot more interesting as these new libraries and so forth get built. Right now, we have been out for about a year. We have effectively this GitHub that's been very popular. We've got about, almost 5,000 people on it. I think we're the third most popular Google GitHub, which is really fun. I had a little bit of a scare, by the way, when I first did it. I went through the proper launch process within Google. We got the whole thing out in GitHub. And on my personal account, I tweeted, really excited to announce that we're working. And then in 20 minutes, I got a ping from a senior PM on Google management staff. He said, you're on TechCrunch. Within 20 minutes, there was an article on TechCrunch about this thing. Not only had the guy discovered it, but he written the article about it. And it kind of made me realize you have to be careful. But it was really interesting how quickly this got interest and how people got excited by it and got involved with it. But the really critical part about this is that everything about this is open. The beacon is open, the client is open, and the server is open. This cannot be a Google product. This must be a part of the open web. And we're really excited that companies like Opera and Firefox have both talked about the fact that they're going to implement their own versions. Opera Labs is available right now, and Firefox OS is working on it as we speak. And this thrills us to no end because so often people feel like, especially in Germany I have to say, people feel that Google is trying to like track everything, which is not true, but they still like to say that. And I'm like, fine, don't use our version, use the Opera version. And they're like, okay, that's cool. And that's the beauty of being open source, because it's clearly not a Google product. It can't be. It's meant to be part of the web. And so we're thrilled that all these companies are kind of jumping on board. The other problem, though, the last thing I want to mention about the issue I have is the fact that IBeacon did come along first, and it does a really good job at what it's supposed to do, but it has kind of established this model of interaction. And every time I talk, people come up and ask the same two things, which is, can I push coupons? And can I track the user? To which I can only politely say no. Because that's not the model. That's what they can do more things than that, of course, but it's the primary issue about what IBeacon is doing is that they're basically doing things in the background. They're doing scanning, and that allows you to do some very clever things, some really useful things. But this is really much more about a discovery system of things around you, and so people get frustrated that you can't do it, and if you're going to come and ask me afterwards, I'll just say sorry. So the other thing I've discovered is that we went on this journey assuming that this was going to be kind of like God's gift to IoT. And so the first thing I did was I built an interactive vending machine. I bought one on Craigslist for 250 bucks. I carried it in, I ripped the back out. It had a little bill feeder that had $26 in it. Ka-ching. It was really interesting. I did that, and I put in a Raspberry Pi, and I got all work. And it was just a kind of a experiment to see what it was going to be like. But then we realized that not just big things was interesting, it was also kind of smaller things like bus stops and movie posters. And this idea that it was just the smaller you got, the more interesting it became. And we were kind of surprised by that. And then we got another realization that it wasn't corporate things or government things, it was personal things. So imagine that you are presenting some slides to somebody, and your laptop could just project the URL to people in the room. Or you could put one on your dog, so if it gets lost, someone could find it and call you, or call a service to do it. Or even a for sale sign. In the United States, we put for sale signs in our car. Imagine just getting like a 6-pack of these things at Walgreens and just kind of quickly setting it up and just throwing it in the back of the car. And now, in addition to your phone number, you could see like the repair history and information about that. So it's about the fact that anything now can just sprout a little bit more information. We think that's a very liberating thing for people, not just corporations. The web has an awful lot to teach us about how it's successful, because you guys have heard about the long tail of the web. It was invented by Wired magazine, by Chris Anderson. It's the idea that if you add up all the e-commerce of all the sites on the web, it's like gajillions of times bigger than Amazon, right? The web is powerful because it's millions of little tiny things that add up. And as you start to talk about interacting with like vending machines and buses and suitcases and toasters, the whole idea is that we're now having this long tail of interaction. Each one of these use cases is kind of meh, it's not a big deal, but the fact that there's millions of them is actually kind of not meh. It's actually kind of interesting. The other thing that we kind of realized is it's not really about IoT anymore. That toaster can be the world's stupidest toaster. All it wants to do is have a little phone number to tell you how to recycle it, or to have a toaster recipe of the day, if that is possible. Or effectively ways in which that you can clean the crumb tray, or a video on how to use it or clean it and so forth. It's like these things, if you buy a toaster today, it's covered in URLs and QR codes. And then what you do, you just throw that whole box away, and a marketer somewhere loses his wings. And they get really frustrated with that. And now you can kind of carry the experience into the home. So basically, in summary, I just want to kind of leave you with 5 points. And that is that effectively the whole goal of the physical web has been UX driven. It's not a surprise the project was started by a UX designer, because we really wanted to make the superpower of the web available to everything. The other one is that it's user first. We're designing everything from the privacy to the security to the way that we're presenting to the user to even the push notifications to make sure the user is always in control. And everything we do is available on the GitHub, and we have discussions about it on the GitHub. And people have asked us a lot of questions. If you have any questions about that, ask a question on the GitHub and we'll talk to you about it. The other one is that not only is it open source, it's no centralized server. You don't have to ask for anyone's permission to make a beacon. And that's a huge difference. You just can grab something and just plop it up. And we think that's going to enable kind of this crazy network effect the web engenders, to make it really easy to do this kind of thing. And of course, as the web improves, so does the physical web. So we're going to stick to our knitting, as we say. We're going to do just this really razor-thin discovery service, and other cool things will happen as we go. And the other one is that the real surprise to me was the breakthrough use cases were small. I kept expecting to talk to bigger and bigger devices, more interesting things. But really, honestly, small is beautiful. And I really think that being able to enable these tiny things is really going to be transformative. But the key takeaway I want to leave with you guys is that this is not a product. This is a web standard. And it will only succeed if we, as a community, want it to succeed. This is why I call this building the physical web together. We're kind of kickstarting it and getting it going, but it will not succeed if you guys don't want it and don't want to kind of play around with it. And so please, this is why I'm coming to these conferences, this is why we talk, is to kind of get people interested and talk more about it. So please find me afterwards and we'll talk some more. Thank you very much.